Hi everyone, and welcome back. I hope you guys all had a good Halloween. If you can believe it, it's somehow November now, and we're heading into what's really the last stretch of this class. So the topic for today is qualitative research. This will be a change from a lot of what we've done in the previous parts of the semester, which have focused on different types of quantitative research. So today we're going to be taking a brief tour through methods to understand data that is not numerical. So data that focuses on text or words or social settings or interactions, all sorts of things that can't be easily reduced to numbers. Before I do that though, I just want to give you guys some reminders about the projects that will be due over the next couple of weeks in this class. So as a reminder, the first project will be due this Sunday at 11:59 p.m. That's November 8th, if you choose to complete it. And this project is to take a look at a published experiment or quasi-experiment evaluating a criminal justice program, and then evaluate it in terms of its internal and external validity. And that takes the form of a short memo aimed at a practitioner audience, so as plain language as you can make it. The second project is due Sunday, November 22nd at 11:59 p.m. And as a quick reminder, this project, if you choose to complete it, involves coming up with a research question and designing a survey that would allow you to answer that question. The survey itself should take about 5 minutes to complete, include an independent variable, a dependent variable, and at least 3 control variables. The third project I will be talking about at the end of this lecture, and this one finally will be due at the very end of the semester on Sunday, December 6th at 11:59 p.m. This one, as I will talk about later in this lecture as well, has 2 options you can pick. One option, which is what I typically assign, involves you going out into the world and interacting with people, which obviously in these COVID times is not the best idea for everyone. So it's still an option if you can find a safe way to do it, but if not, there will be a different option. But that's why there are 2 of them that would both be due at this time. Again, I'll talk about details for both of those at the end of this lecture. And as a general reminder, you need to complete 2 out of the 3 project options that are listed here. So you need to submit something on 2 out of these 3 due dates. If you complete all 3 projects, your lowest score will be dropped. So you have the option to complete each one, and if you do, I'll drop your score. The only thing I'll say about this is that for project 3, you have to pick one of those 2 A or B options. So you can't submit 4 things to me. You can only submit 3 things, 1 project per due date. All right, so with that, I'm going to get into the material for this week. So what is qualitative research? Broadly, qualitative research describes any research methods that generate non-numerical data. So this is data or information about the world that isn't in the form of something that can be easily counted. And we're going to talk about a couple of forms of qualitative research. One of them is content analysis. And content analysis involves looking through any sort of text data and looking for things that are consistent throughout the data and using them to identify themes within whatever that text is. Another type of research that generates non-numerical data is interviewing. So if you interview people and ask them questions about themselves and their thoughts and their lives, you're going to get a lot of information back, and it's not going to be in the form of numbers either. Another type of qualitative research that we'll talk about is fieldwork. And fieldwork involves actually going out into a setting and observing what's happening there and trying to get a really, really detailed and grounded idea of what that social setting is like and what the people in it are like and how social interactions go, and a number of other things. So these are the 3 different types of qualitative research that I'm going to be talking about in this lecture. Also, just as a quick reminder, thinking about quantitative versus qualitative research. Quantitative research often gives you information about large numbers of people or large numbers of whatever unit of analysis you're looking at. But it gives you information that's often pretty limited. So for example, if you're doing a quantitative study on gang activities, you could get information about things like, an average age at joining a gang. That's numerical data. Patterns of involvement with the criminal justice system. So how often are gang members involved with the criminal justice system? How often do they get arrested? That sort of thing. So that's all stuff that can be counted. Common types of activities. What are the common things that are done by gang members together? So you could get information on all of this, but it would all be relatively surface level because you have to be able to quantify it and make tallies of these different things that you could be interested in. With qualitative research, on the other hand, you could get a much deeper dive into the actual social part of this. So if you spent time with a gang, you could learn about initiation processes, you could learn about the different norms for interaction and how people talk to each other and interact with each other or with members of other gangs. You could understand what they think and feel about the criminal justice system. You could really get a much deeper look at what's going on by using qualitative methods. And this goes back to what we talked about way back at the beginning of the semester of that sort of play between generalizability and information that can apply widely and information that is specific but applies more narrowly. And oftentimes, if we're looking at qualitative research, we're taking that narrower view. And instead of trying to explain social phenomena in really broad terms that can apply widely, we want to dig into the more specific types of interactions that people have and experiences and thoughts and that sort of thing. And both types of research are really, really important because, you need to be able to understand broad processes, but that almost never tells the whole story. So qualitative research is really important if you want to truly understand what's going on. Qualitative research generally has advantages and disadvantages that are related to what I was talking about on the last slide. One huge advantage of qualitative research is generally detail. You can get a lot of information about whatever the subject of qualitative research is, because it's not limited to formats that can be converted into numerical data. So you can just get as much information about any particular detailed part of, a person's life or a social setting or, what's in a text. There's really no limit to the amount of detail that you can record in qualitative research. In talking about qualitative research, terms that you might hear are thin and thick description. Thin description talks about just describing what you see or what you hear. Thick description involves giving context to that. So an example of thin description might be saying, a person winked. That's something that happened. You could record that. If you were out doing social observation, for example, you might notice that one person winked. If you're doing thick description, though, you're really, really trying to understand what it means and including all those details. So thick description might be, person A winked at person B after person B told a silly joke and, here's what the joke was. So with thick description, you're trying to really put a lot of detail to each sort of action or interaction that you're recording to give you that nice sort of juicy context that you want in qualitative research. Another advantage of qualitative research is validity. And one of the main ideas here is that qualitative research can be done in natural settings. If you're doing social observation, you're actually going somewhere and seeing what's going on. So you know that what you're seeing is really sort of the truth of what's going on there. As opposed to, say, a survey where you might be asking people to report on their perceptions, or if you're looking at archival data, you'd be looking at records of things, and those things might not match reality as well as literally being in reality itself. And another thing that can be a huge advantage in qualitative research is that if you're working with participants, so if you're interviewing people or if you're in a social setting, you can ask them what they think. And if you've taken a lot of notes, you can read them to people or give them to people to read, and they can tell you what seems right and what seems wrong and, what you are understanding correctly about their lives and what you're not understanding correctly. So that's a huge, huge benefit when it comes to validity and truth in what you're researching. Another advantage to qualitative research is that it's often very flexible. So unlike a study where you have to get a lot of things prepared beforehand, like in building a survey or designing an experiment, qualitative research often develops as it goes. And as you learn more about a social setting or a group of people, or as you read more into a text, whatever kind of method you're using, there's often a lot of opportunity to think of new ideas and adapt your methods and really work your study so that it's getting the best possible picture of your topic of interest. So in other words, you can respond to new information in the course of doing research. And in general, qualitative research is great for exploring and describing the world. So here, you're often not trying to test theories. You're often not doing sort of a formal analysis of causation or anything like that. But it's really, really useful for getting a sense for what's going on and gaining information that you wouldn't have thought of to begin with. So it's really good for grounding future research as well. Qualitative research does have some disadvantages though, and one has to do with reliability. So reliability, if you remember, is the idea that if you were to do the same measurement process over and over again, you'd come up with the same answers. And so if you're thinking about interacting with people or being in a social setting, or even just reading a text and pulling out what you think is important, oftentimes there's a lot of subjectivity that goes into that and a lot of chance as well. So one thing is that little choices made by researchers can have a huge impact on the data that comes back. So even if you imagine you're interviewing people, the different questions that you ask or the ways that you respond to people's answers could completely change the direction of the conversation and bring you to different areas each time. Same thing with going out into the world in a social setting. Every choice made by a researcher is going to return sort of a different picture of what's going on. Another disadvantage is generalization. And this is similar to what I said on the last slide, which is the idea that if you're taking a really close look at some social phenomenon, chances are what you find is going to be specific to whatever it is that you're looking at. And most of the time, samples used in qualitative research, if there's even a sample at all, are small non-probability samples. So if you're doing interviews of a group of people, chances are, if you're doing in-depth interviews, you're recruiting people from some particular setting, or through some social network, and you're getting access in whatever way you can. But it's not going to be a national survey that can be, applied widely to everyone and everything most of the time. It'll generally be information that's pretty specific to what it is you're looking at. And another potential issue is that there is often a lot of subjectivity involved here as well. And so this is an issue in thinking about reliability, but it may also be an issue in thinking about generalization as well. So what some researchers take from a particular sample or a particular study may not necessarily apply elsewhere if it's filtered through, that particular lens. All right, so that was a broad overview of qualitative research. Now I'm going to talk about some of the different methods for conducting qualitative research. And as a quick note, you can take entire classes on qualitative research. You can take entire classes on social observation alone. So what we're going to talk about today is going to be a pretty brief overview of each of these different topics. But it should give you some tools that are handy, both in interpreting any qualitative research that you might come across or in conducting it yourself. So starting with content analysis. Content analysis can be defined as a process of organizing non-numerical information into codes and themes. So let me unpack what that actually means. So we should be down with non-numerical information already. Non-numerical information, in this case, generally refers to information that's in the format of text. So this could be text that you find in some sort of media source. It could be text in a book. It could be tweets. It could be the transcript of an interview that you took. It could be, everything that was said in a courtroom on a particular day. If it's non-numerical information, you can do content analysis with it. Sorry, if it's textual information that's non-numerical, you could do content analysis with it. And there are a couple of types of data that are often common in content analysis. So one would be existing data that you could just go out there and find right now. So news stories, advertisements, political speeches, etc. anything that is recorded and available for the reading. But content analysis can also be useful for interpreting data collected by the researcher using other qualitative methods, such as the ones I'll talk about later today. So as I said, you could do it with interview data. You could also do it with notes that are taken during social observation. Again, as long as there is textual information there, you can do content analysis. And a big goal in content analysis is using what's called manifest content to identify latent content. And manifest content refers to what you actually see in front of you on the page. So the manifest content of a news article are the actual sentences written out in that news article. The manifest content in an interview transcript are the actual answers given by the interviewee during that interview. Latent content, on the other hand, refers to the broader ideas or themes or things that sort of emerge from what's actually said. So if you read a news article or read several news articles, you might notice things that they have in common or ideas that tend to come up a lot or, themes that appear in different ways across those news articles. Those bigger ideas that are separate from literally just the words on the page are what we think of as latent content. And the biggest goal in content analysis is to try to determine what those themes are. So what are the main ideas? How are they interpreted in whatever form of media or data you're looking at? And as we'll talk about, there are systematic ways of moving from manifest content, so what's actually on the page or the screen in front of you, and latent content, which are the ideas that are really behind those words. And oftentimes you might think of content analysis as involving sort of steps that move from one end of this continuum to the other, from data that is most visible on the page itself to ideas that are most broad and conceptual, and there's a word I want that's not coming to me, but you get the idea, sort of distance from the writing on the page itself. So the sort of place to start and the place that best describes manifest content in its purest form is the actual content of what you're looking at. And you can call each unit of content that you might be interested in as a meaning unit. So if you're looking through an interview, each meaning unit might be a sentence that somebody says. If you're looking at, Twitter, for example, each meaning unit might be a single tweet. If you're looking at a blog post, each meaning unit might be a sentence. If you're looking at comments on a website, each meaning unit might be, an individual person's comment or a paragraph within it. And the meaning unit will really depend on what your interest is and, how the information goes together best. So it's really a judgment call for what you would consider a meaning unit. But it's usually about the length of a sentence or a couple sentences. An example of a meaning unit is the sentence that I have here, which comes from the 1972 Republican Party platform. And this comes from a project that I did starting a couple years ago, where we looked at the different moral values that are invoked in party platforms going from 1972 to 2016. And so this one I just pulled out, and you'll see some examples of these later on as well. And in the Republican Party platform, it was stated, "We believe that the law must apply equally to all and that it must be an instrument of justice." So this is just a sentence that was written in the party platform. And for anybody who's not aware, party platforms are crafted by each party during each presidential election, and they're just documents out there that can be viewed stating what the party is running on, what they believe, what policies they think are important, and so on. So your meaning unit, your manifest content, are the actual words on the page. You can then move from a meaning unit to what can be called a condensed meaning unit, or essentially a summary of what was said there. So you don't need all the words, but you're looking for sort of the main content or idea in that sentence or sentences that you have. So if you look at that sentence there, we say, we believe that the law must apply equally to all and that it must be an instrument of justice. You could condense that or summarize it into equal application of the law and law as a tool of justice. So this would be, a note that you could take on your computer, or you could do this in a spreadsheet where you take each meaning unit and then condense it. And also as a quick note, this was a fun project because the political parties really have changed how they talk about crime and justice over the years. And so if you look in the 60s and 70s, both sides are very, very gung-ho about sort of equality and justice. If you look at the 90s, both sides are very gung-ho about punishing everybody. And then there are other points at which they diverge. So tangential, but fun fact. So here we can then keep moving from our manifest content to our latent content. And codes are what you could call conceptual labels. So if you think about concept, a concept is an idea or a picture that you might have in your head that we attach a label to. And a code means that you're just labeling different aspects of your meaning units with these sort of conceptual ideas. And in this particular statement, if you're looking at values, which we were, we're looking at ideas like equality and justice. So equal application of the law, the big value there is equality. Right? The law is a tool of justice. One of the values that's being invoked there is justice. So with each of these steps, we're moving from the text itself to the more abstract ideas. And abstract is exactly the word that I was looking for on the last slide. So you're moving from the text that you can actually see to the ideas that are more abstract. From codes, you can then develop what are called categories. And categories would just be groupings of codes that make sense under whatever set of theoretical ideas you're working with. And in this particular project, we considered both ideas of equality and ideas about justice to both fall under a broader category of fairness, which includes sort of a set of values that, are similar to each other. So we'd say in this statement, we have ideas about equality, ideas about justice, and in general, they're both really invoking this main value of fairness. And then finally, the last step in moving from manifest content to latent content is to identify themes. And themes are the main ideas that emerge from your different codes and categories of codes. And from just one sentence, it's hard to really get a theme. But what you could pull from just this single meaning unit that we have here is that, one of the things that this political party platform invokes, one of the values that it talks about, is fairness. And it uses this idea of fairness to justify policy choices. So this is a broader idea. This isn't something that is explicitly stated, right, in our original meaning unit, which is just the text that's in the party platform itself. Instead, this is a bigger idea that we've drawn by condensing that meaning unit into its main ideas, applying codes that are relevant to our research, right? So I'm interested in values specifically, which means that the codes I'm using are codes that correspond to different values that people might have. Then we categorize those codes into groupings that make sense together. And in the theory I was working with specifically, fairness was an important grouping. And so from there, you can pull this more abstract idea that, fairness is one of the things that political parties will use to try to justify policy choices that they make. And I'm going to go through another example of this right now as well. So this one I'll do a little bit quicker because it's going to be the same thing. But this is just going to show a different example of a different statement from a party platform. And this one happened to be the 1984 Democrat Party platform. And here they say, we need a criminal justice system that both upholds our Constitution and reflects our values. So that's the manifest content. That's the specific thing that was written out in this party platform. Your condensed meaning unit, again, is just a summary of what that original sentence said. And here, the summary or main idea is that criminal justice system should uphold Constitution and reflect American values. So you're taking the original text and you're just summarizing it in a way that's a little bit more succinct and focused on what it is you're interested in. codes, again, are those conceptual values, or sorry, conceptual labels that you can apply to the ideas in your meaning unit. And so codes you might think about here would be, upholding tradition or upholding traditional texts and values. And these codes, as I'll talk about in a minute, can be really variable. This study, again, was focused on values in particular, so the codes are all focused on, these things that people consider values. But when you potentially do this as one of your projects, you'll have some leeway in terms of what you want to think about. From there, you would move to these broader categories, which are groupings of codes. And under the theory we were working with, authority and loyalty were big sort of groups of values that people tend to think about and talk about. So from this statement, you can get the idea that people think about upholding tradition and upholding traditional texts and values, and American values specifically. And here there are some ideas about authority. We have to think about the Constitution as an authority. Loyalty, we have to really focus on making sure America stays America, right? So these are values that people hold, and they can be given labels like authority and loyalty. And so a theme that could emerge from this statement would be that this platform invokes tradition and group solidarity to justify policy choices. And again, typically when you're thinking about themes, you're looking at your set of data as a whole. So you're really looking at patterns that emerge, you're looking at ideas that come up a lot, you're generally using more than just one meaning unit. But for the purposes of this, I'm going through this example with this one sentence. So the theme again would be this more abstract idea that ideas about tradition and group solidarity are used to justify policy choices by American political parties. And so we have a very similar idea to what was on the last slide, just using a different sentence now. But you can imagine if you looked at hundreds and hundreds of statements like these, which I have done, you start to see patterns emerging, and you can start to think about, which values does each party invoke more? Are Democrats more likely to justify policy choices by talking about fairness as a value or tradition and group solidarity as a value? And it turns out they are, contrary to these particular examples that I've given you. So in thinking about taking themes from your data, you really want to look at the overall pattern of ideas that emerges after you've gone through and coded all of the content in it. Also, as a quick note, in actually doing this, you don't necessarily have to go through each one of these steps. So it's possible to start with a meaning unit and just code it from there. So you might read this and say, we need a criminal justice system that upholds our Constitution and reflects our values. And just say, our code there is uphold traditional texts and, reflect values. So you don't necessarily need that condensed meaning unit stage, but it can be helpful depending on the type of data that you're working with. Same thing with categories. So sometimes just having codes will be enough. And you could imagine just going through and coding this, authority and loyalty. And those would be your codes, and then you wouldn't need to necessarily group them into a broader category. But going from codes to categories is a tool that can be helpful if you're looking for patterns in your data specifically. But the end goal is always to go from meaning units to themes with codes as a stop in the middle. So things to think about when developing a coding scheme during content analysis. The first big question is, what will you code for? And if you're doing a project on values, it makes sense to code for different types of values that have been, identified in the literature before, which is what we did. But you can do content analysis for any kind of text and for any kind of research idea or framework. So what you code for could be a really long list. So you could just be coding for attributes. So attributes are just any characteristics that someone or something has. And if you were, say, coding an interview, you might code for the number of times that somebody described the justice system as good. So that would just be, an attribute that, the justice system as good that appeared in the interview data. You could code for mentions of people or organizations or institutions. If you were coding that interview data, you could think about, how many times does the person mention the police? How many times does the person mention corrections? So these are each things that could be assigned to different meaning units. Processes or interactions or events. So again, imagine you're thinking about interview data just with people asking them what they think about the justice system. You might code for any time somebody mentions some interaction that they have with the police or with the courts. Processes. You could talk about an arrest that occurred, right? Anytime somebody mentions that they or somebody they know were arrested, that could be a process. So processes, interactions, events, all referring to sort of things that happen that people might talk about or that might end up in textual data somewhere. Explanations. So another thing you could code for would be the sort of explanations or justifications that people give to things. And so you could, if you were looking at interview data and what people think about the justice system, you could look for any time you saw people say, the justice system is bad because they treat people unfairly. And so that would be an explanation, this sort of because they treat people unfairly part. And so that would be something that you could code for, and you could see how, different types of explanations for things appear in data. Values. So this is the one I've already talked about. Most of my research is on morality, so anytime I do my own examples, it's stuff like this. But you can also code for values, so things that people care about or believe in or see as morally important to themselves. So when it comes to coding, you have a lot of options, and it really, really depends on what it is that you happen to be interested in and what you think will be important as you go through your project. And before I talk about this reliability that I just popped up here, I'll also say in deciding what to code for, it's often really, really helpful to read through some of what you'll be coding first and just see what strikes you. See what ideas seem to be common, see what things seem to be important to the person who's talking or writing, see what things just seem like they might be interesting from a research perspective. And you can use that to guide your decision for what to code for. Because the main goal in content analysis is to use the text you have in front of you to come up with these broader themes and ideas in a way that is systematic. But to know where to start, it helps to, think a little bit about those broader ideas first. All right, so let's think about reliability now. One big issue in thinking about coding is how reliable that will be. And you can imagine that if I were to go through and code an entire, interview of somebody and their attitudes about the justice system, what I would find interesting and what I would code for and how I would interpret different statements might be different than how any of you would, or how you would code it from, compared to each other. And so reliability is something that's often an issue in content analysis because so much of it involves subjective interpretation of what it is that you're looking at. One way around this that you're not going to have to think about for this class, but in general is good to look out for if you're ever looking at research based on content analysis, is something called inter-rater reliability. And inter-rater reliability, we met briefly, but this is where it really has its time to shine, is the idea that you want to see that people are coding the same information in a similar way. So if I want to be sure that my coding scheme is reproducible and sort of makes sense in that way, I might ask somebody else I know or somebody I'm working with on the project to also code the information using the same set of codes and see how well we match up. And oftentimes this is sort of the way that content analysis is evaluated in terms of quality, and especially in terms of reliability is, would two people generate the same set of codes and themes from the same bit of data? And in that last project I showed you, I actually was working with somebody else, and we spent a lot of time, trying to make sure that we were coding the information in a similar way. And it can be harder to do than, you might think to begin with. And then a final thing to think about is, are you testing a theory or building a theory? And content analysis is one of those where you really can go either way. So you can start with theoretical ideas and see how they appear in the data. And I think this isn't quite as common as going in the other direction, but it is possible. So you can say, you know, I would expect Democrats to focus on these values, and I would expect Republicans to focus on these values. Then you can go into the text itself and see which values appear most for each party. So that would be a test of a theory that you have. Right, that would be the deductive research. But you can also use content analysis to build a theory. And as I said before, this is often the goal of qualitative research. So you can go into a text without having a lot of ideas beforehand about what it is that you'll find, and then sort of let the themes show themselves to you as you read the text and as you code and as you think about the ideas that are important in the text that you're looking at. So that would be that fun inductive research, where you're really working from the ground up to get at those bigger, more abstract ideas. And when you build a theory in this way, it's often referred to as grounded theory. All right, so that concludes our tour of content analysis. The next topic that I'm going to talk about is how to do qualitative interviewing. And we're not going to spend a ton of time on this. This is one of those things that you could really dig into more, but since this isn't one of your project options, we'll make this one a little bit shorter. But qualitative interviewing refers to any verbal interaction between an interviewer and a participant that follows a general plan of action. So what that means is that you as the researcher, are interviewing someone verbally, and you're going into it with some sort of plan beforehand. And anything under that umbrella can be considered interviewing in qualitative research. And the goals of qualitative interviewing are to gather first-hand accounts of lived experience. In other words, to hear people's stories in their own words. And as I said before, this is really, really valuable because, as researchers, you really want to know about the people that you're studying. So interviews are a great way to get that kind of information. And it's worth knowing that interviews are always specific to, the individuals you're talking to and the time you're doing it and the place that you're studying them. So generalizability is often something of a weakness in interview research, but on the other hand, the data can be really, really valuable. And as I said before, content analysis can also be used with interview data, so there can be overlap between these different kinds of strategies as well. And we're going to talk about a couple of sort of basics in designing an interview for qualitative research. Questions versus probes. This idea is just about the distinction between asking a question and following up on an answer. So in interviewing, a question is any literal question that you might ask. So, can you tell me more? Can you tell me about this? What's your experience with this? A probe, on the other hand, is a follow-up to an answer. So, can you tell me about your last experience with police? Get an answer. And then you might have a follow-up could be, can you go into more detail about, how you think they treated you in this context? Whatever the case might be. But questions are the initial question, and then probes are, follow-ups to things that have already been said. Other terms to know are scheduled and unscheduled. Scheduled means that you plan to ask it or plan to do the probe. So you can have an interview where you have a bunch of questions written out that you plan to ask. You can also have probes that are planned or scheduled, which would be follow-ups that you intend to ask after an answer has already been given. So, can you tell me about your experience with police? It could be that you're going to plan to ask about, their feelings about how police treated them, regardless of what that original answer is. So that would be an example of a scheduled question and a scheduled probe. But a cool thing about interviewing is that you can also have unplanned interactions, and these are referred to as unscheduled. So unscheduled questions and probes come when somebody says something interesting and you want to follow up. So these are responses to things said by the interviewee themselves, and they could be questions or they could just be, things that you want to follow up on a particular statement about, so a probe. But the idea is that they are sort of inspired by the interview itself rather than planned out beforehand. And with these definitions, there are a couple of different types of qualitative interviews that can be conducted. Structured interviews are interviews that consist only of scheduled questions and probes. So you ask your list of questions and follow-ups to those questions, record whatever answers you get, and then that's it, you're done. An advantage to this is similar to an advantage on any survey, which is that you get answers that can be compared to each other because they're being given in response to the same questions. But there are several disadvantages to this method, which make it something that's really not recommended in most circumstances. One is that you get a lack of depth. You're only getting answers to what you thought to ask to the beginning, so you can't dig into anything deeper. You can't really unpack ideas that come up organically. You're just stuck with whatever's given in response to your list of questions. Along those lines, there's no way to account for unexpected answers. So if somebody says something really, really interesting, you just have to let it go because you have to move on to your next question if you're doing a structured interview. And another thing is that a lot of previous knowledge is required. So similar to making a survey, you have to put a whole lot of thought into what you're asking if you want to get good answers back. But unlike a survey where the goal is to get information from a whole lot of people at a more surface level, it's really a disadvantage in a structured interview because you can't take advantage of the insights that the interviewee can give you as a researcher, which are incredibly valuable. So because of that, generally structured interviews are not recommended, but it's good to know what they are. A good type of interview to do, and one that is more recommended, is a semi-structured interview. And a semi-structured interview means that you have a list of questions and follow-ups that you want to ask, but if somebody says something interesting, you dig into it. So that's all that means. You have scheduled questions and probes, so you have questions and follow-ups that you plan to ask, but then as people say things that are interesting, you can also ask unplanned follow-up questions. So that would be what unscheduled probes are. So start with a list of questions, but also follow up as it makes sense to do so. And advantages here are that you get comparable answers to the questions you plan to ask, but you also have a lot of flexibility to dig in more deeply to other ideas that you as the researcher didn't think about to begin with. And the same disadvantage as in a structured interview is that you do have to have a plan beforehand. So you have to go in with some amount of knowledge or expectations about how it's going to go and what answers will be most relevant to you. So it's hard to do one of these semi-structured interviews if you're going into a context that not a whole lot is known about. And finally, that brings us to our last type of qualitative interview, which is an unstructured interview. And an unstructured interview is made up of unstructured probes only. In other words, it's a conversation. So you talk to somebody and you follow up on what they say. They talk to you more, you follow up on what they say. So it's really just like having a conversation with somebody. And in doing this, you can use something called an interview guide, which is a general set of topics that you want to cover, but you're not actually starting with a written list of questions. And unstructured interviews are also really valuable, and I say especially in situations where less is known about the group of people or topic that you might be interested in. And big advantages to this method are flexibility and depth. So it's a conversation. It can go anywhere that a conversation could go. And you can really dig in deeply to different ideas or topics as they come up. And then the one disadvantage to this method, though, is that you're not going to be able to compare across different participants. If you're just having a conversation with every single person, they could end up being completely different conversations. So you'll get a lot of information, but it's less useful if you want to compare answers. So the takeaway from this slide should be that if you're doing qualitative interviews, don't do a structured interview if you can help it. But based on how much you want to be able to compare answers or how much you know about the topic beforehand, you would want to do either a semi-structured interview or an unstructured interview. Those are both good ways to go. All right, so now I'm going to just move to some tips for conducting good quality interviews. And first, these are things that you would want to think about before the interview actually starts. Well, one of the things you're going to do if you're doing a structured or semi-structured interview is write interview questions. And so you have to think about which questions and topics are going to be of most interest. This is an area where you'd want to look to other research in the area. You'd want to know what's known about this group. You'd want to just think about what's interesting to you as a researcher. And from there, you'd want to take care to develop questions that are clear and concise and neutral. So last week, we talked all about how to ask questions and how to ask them in ways that aren't confusing or leading or any other kind of thing. And it's really a similar idea in conducting qualitative interviews. So some of what we talked about last week doesn't apply because there's no multiple choice options. But in thinking about writing good questions for interviews, many of those ideas are the same. And a key goal is to, again, not confuse anybody or not lead anybody with your questions. So again, best practices for survey design apply here too. Another thing to think about in qualitative interviews is gaining access. And oftentimes, qualitative interviews are used to understand groups that are difficult to access. So in criminology and criminal justice, you might be interested in interviewing members of populations that are involved in offending. You might be interested in interviewing people who work in the criminal justice system. And either way, it can often be difficult to really get good access as a researcher to members of the population that you're interested in. And so, again, this is the case whether you're looking at a formal organization like a police department or more informal organizations or subcultures. So an informal organization might be something like a gang. A subculture, is any subcultural group that has its own norms and values and, does things separately from what is often thought of as like mainstream culture. And there are different strategies for gaining access to different types of groups that you might be interested in. But in some ways they're similar. So if you're looking at a formal organization, typically you'd need to find what would be called a sponsor. And a sponsor is somebody who's going to vouch for you and say that, you, the researcher, are here in good faith to interview members of this organization. And if you think about criminal justice organizations in particular, they're often very insular. They don't want to talk to people about what it is they're doing. They don't want that kind of scrutiny. And they especially don't want some researcher, who's never been in that job to come in and talk about what a bad job they're doing. So there's always that fear that that's what you, the researcher, are going to do. So having a sponsor who's willing to sort of vouch for your intentions can be very good. Similarly, if you want to talk to somebody who's involved in a particular subculture, it really helps to get to know somebody who's in that subculture first, who can help introduce you to people or sort of work their social network to help gain access. But in either of them, it takes some time and effort to get to know people and really prove to those people that you do have good intentions and you're not just here to paint them in a bad light and then leave. So moving on, as I said, this would be a brief tour here. Things to think about during the interview. One is the interview technique itself. And something that's helpful to do is to lead with questions that will make interviewees comfortable. So this is different from ordering your survey. In a typical survey, you want to start with questions that are interesting because you want people to want to keep taking the survey. If you're interviewing people in this sort of more intimate setting where it's just you and the person or you in a small group, and you really want to dig deep into what they think and what they've experienced, it's not a good idea to start with the questions that are most interesting to you. And instead, you want to give them a chance to just open up a little bit and talk about something that is comfortable to them to talk about. So depending on what population you're looking at, that could be different. But you really want to think about how you open that interview to make the interview as comfortable as possible. Another important thing is to be reflexive. And this means think about, your own position in talking to this person. And be aware of who you are coming in and who you are in relation to them and, how they might see you. And in doing this, you're really just trying to take a perspective and just be aware of, what you're bringing to the conversation and to the table and, any biases or privileges that you might have that could be an issue in having the interview, and try to make sure that you address that before you, and as you conduct the interview itself. So just always be thinking about sort of your own position as a researcher during the process. And all of this sort of goes towards the goal of establishing what's called rapport. And rapport just means that there is sort of trust and a good flow of conversation. And you want to feel like you're just talking to somebody when you're doing an interview. You don't want to feel like you're interrogating them. So the goal of a good interview technique is to make it feel like a comfortable conversation where you're somebody who they would want to tell things to, and that you can kind of feel that sense of enjoyment of the conversation and trust both ways. So that's rapport, and that's really the tone that you'd want to go for in an interview like this. In actually doing the interview, there's also the practical consideration of how to record the data. The best possible way to do it is to record it on, some kind of recording device. These days, phones will do just about anything. And just have that running as you talk and write it all out, or use data transcription, whatever, later. And if that's not possible, you can take notes about what they're saying. But if you take notes rather than just recording everything, you're going to be distracted. It's going to be harder to establish that sort of conversational tone that you want. And you're going to miss things that people say. You're going to miss their inflection. There's a lot that doesn't get captured if you're just taking notes. So the best way to do an interview is to record the conversation itself and then write it out later. And another useful thing to do as a qualitative researcher, so somebody who's doing interviews like this, is to take notes to yourself about the process itself. So as you interview people and you think about things and you think about what's working and not working, it's good to write it all out so that you remember when you go back and listen to the interview what was going on at the time and what you took note of, and have some context for the conversation itself. So that would be a memo about the research process. And quick note, this is a memo in a different term than the one that we're doing for the project. So for the project, that's like a sort of a formal memo that you would submit to someone. Here, memo just refers to notes taken to yourself. All right, so that is our tour through interviewing. The last stop in qualitative research today is going to be field research. And field research refers to conducting observation of an actual social setting. So this is the one where you, the researcher, leave your office, go somewhere and spend time there and see what happens. And a specific type of field research that is common is ethnography, which is focused on providing a really detailed and accurate picture of some particular social setting. So in other words, you're trying to study the social setting itself while you're in it. And in conducting field research or ethnography, there is always going to be a line between participation and observation. And different forms of this research can rely more heavily on one or the other. At the one end of the spectrum, you could be a complete participant. In other words, you are fully a part of what's going on. And as an example of this, there's a book that a researcher wrote about being a police officer. And to write the book, he was hired by a police department and actually worked as a police officer for a year, and then wrote about what that experience was like. So that would be an example of being a complete participant. You are fully a part of whatever social setting it is that you're studying. Sort of moving away from that, another way to do ethnographic research is to be what would be called a participant observer. And a participant observer would be a researcher who is as involved as possible without losing researcher status. So an example of being a participant observer might be to, spend a couple of days in a local jail and do every single thing that everybody else in the jail does. But the difference is that you didn't get arrested for a crime to get there, right? You're keeping your status as a researcher, but you are being as involved as possible and participating in what's going on. Moving away from that, we're now flipping the order of these words. So we're moving further towards the end of this spectrum towards just observation. So a researcher who is an observer participant is somebody who's going to be present and will participate sometimes, but mostly they're just watching. So as an example of this, if you are an observer participant, you might go into a courtroom, speak to the members of the court a little bit, maybe talk to some people you're sitting next to, but for the most part, you're just watching what's going on. And you're not trying to participate in the proceedings of whatever the social setting is. And then finally, you could be a complete observer, which would mean that you are only watching and recording what's going on, but you're not interacting at all with anybody in that social setting. And an example of this would just be to go to a street corner where there's an open air drug market and just watch what happens, but don't talk to anybody. So in that case, you would be a complete observer. You would just be watching what's happening. So as you can see here, again, it's a spectrum from, you're participating to you're not participating at all, with different steps along the way. So if you're doing this, how do you actually record observations? Unlike an interview where you can just have a conversation being recorded, it's a lot harder to accurately record everything that's going on in a social setting. And also, this is my friend who just stopped by. So recording observations. In a social observation, the recorded observations are the data. So whatever you record is the data that you're going to be able to work with later. So it's really important to think about how you are recording that data. One way to do it is to do it in a structured way, which can also be called an environmental survey. And this means that you're going in with a set of things that you're looking for, and you're recording how often they're happening. So let's say you're in that open air drug market. You could be looking for certain types of interactions. You could be looking for physical characteristics of the setting. You could be looking for like police driving by, and each time it happens, you make a note on your checklist. And they have done some studies like this, looking at like police officers, where they have somebody ride along with police officers and then record each time, a number of different things have happened. So that would be a structured observation. But as a general rule, this is not the favored way of doing social observation. And it's not a way that you would ever want to approach ethnography. Okay, so this is going to describe what I just said because I forgot that I had this bullet point here. So distracted by my cat. Structured observations. Use an instrument to record what happens. So you have some sort of instrument, which again is just a checklist of things that you're looking for. And when those things occur, you would record it on that checklist. It's also possible in many situations to use cameras and sound recorders, although, as I mentioned before, that's not always going to be ideal. But if you could imagine that you were actually observing a court setting, you could just have some sort of recorder set up to capture what was going on, I guess as long as it was legal in that court. But I'd say one of the most common ways of recording observations, and one that you want to think about for your alternate third project option, would be something called field notes. And field notes are written notes about whatever was happening in a social setting that you were in. And in writing field notes, it's important to think about what you know, but also to include your thoughts about the setting itself. So if you're writing field notes, you'll want to think about writing down everything that you saw, the interactions you heard, what the social setting itself was like, what the physical setting was like. But field notes also include your own perceptions of what happened. So in field notes, you're trying to give as complete a picture of your immersion in the social setting as you possibly can. So you include what you know, but you also include what you think about what's going on. And the goal is to include as much detail as is humanly possible. So you want these written notes to encompass every single little bit of detail that you could possibly record about a social setting. And field notes generally have two stages. The first stage is referred to as jotted notes. And jotted notes are what you write down when you're actually out there in the field. So there are any little phrases, quotes, keywords, and the like. This is pulled from one of the readings that you put down during the observation and at inconspicuous moments. In today's world, it's really, really easy to write jotted notes because nobody notices somebody who's just typing on their phone. So this is a nice change from the days when people had to go out there with notepads and actually jot down notes. But what you're doing with jotted notes is you're paying attention to the situation, the social setting, anything you could think of to get the best picture of the setting that you're observing. And you're writing down things that will jog your memory. You'll use those jotted notes then to write what are called full field notes. And full field notes are a really, really detailed log of your observations. And I say running log because that's it for people who are, doing multiple sessions of social observation. You would be adding to this each time. If you're only doing one, like you guys will be doing for this project option, if you choose to do it, you'll only have a single log of observations. But your full field notes should include every single possible detail about this place and what you saw and what you heard and the interactions people had with each other and who came and where that you can manage. And the goal is to use the jotted notes to jog your memory to write the full field notes. So your field notes should always include more information than your jotted notes. Because as you see things you jotted down, it should spark your memory and what you thought about it and anything else, and you include that to get your really detailed field notes. In writing field notes, the best thing to do is to write them as soon as possible after the observation. This is because human memories are like sieves and we just forget things all the time and really fast. And so you want to get those field notes down as soon as you possibly can after doing the observation, because you'll remember the most amount of detail that way. And in doing so, as I just said before, you want to supplement your jotted notes with remembered information. So in writing out full field notes, you don't want to not include something just because you forgot to write it down initially. Instead, again, you want to use those jotted notes as a way to jog your memory, and then anything you can remember should go into the field notes. So your field notes should always have more information in them than your jotted notes. Also, some just tips for writing field notes here. One thing is you want to describe the setting, you want to describe the people, and you want to describe the activity. So there's a physical setting that you're going to be in. You want to have a picture of that to start out with. You want to describe the people in that setting. So social observation, it's all about people, right? Social. So you want to describe the types of people you see and what they're doing, and any impressions that you might have of who they are. And then you also want to describe activity. So are people conversing with each other? What are they saying? What are they doing in this space? What are the interactions like? Are they going places? Where are they going? So any sort of activity that the people you see are actually doing. In writing field notes, what you really want are concrete and detailed descriptions. So you don't want to leave anything to the imagination of the reader. You want to have as much detail and sort of concrete facts as you can. So instead of saying somebody told a joke that was funny, you would want to actually write down what that joke was. So you want as much detail and as much sort of concrete information as you can include in them. Look at that. So write out the joke instead of just saying the person was funny. Another really important thing to do is to include quotes and then to be able to distinguish between a quote that somebody says and something that you're paraphrasing later on. So quotes are really good. They include a lot of rich detail. They get a sense for how people are talking to each other. So they're good to include. But oftentimes, if you're just in a social setting, you're not going to be able to capture every single word that somebody says. So you may end up paraphrasing things that are said as well. But when writing out field notes, it's important to distinguish between something that you're paraphrasing and then something that was actually said. Another Another tip is to include all your ideas and your hunches and impressions and feelings. So as I said before, in writing field notes, you want to include concrete descriptions of the things that you've actually seen, but you also want to provide as complete a picture of your own immersion in that setting as you can. So you want to include things that you've thought about, hunches that you might have, any impressions you had about the situation, feelings that you had, because this is all useful information that will sort of be helpful in developing research ideas later. And also in putting the information that you have in context, especially if you come back to it at a later time. Okay, so that was the last slide on that. And in the next couple of minutes here, I'm just going to briefly talk about the activity that will be due this Thursday, and then assign the third project option. So in the activity due Thursday, I'm going to ask you guys to practice content analysis using more of those political party platform statements that I did in the examples. And so I have a short list of crime-related statements from the 2016 political party platforms. Don't have up to 2020 yet in this particular data set. So we're looking at crime-related statements from last election's political party platforms, and this will be posted to Blackboard. I think there's maybe 8 statements total, something like that. And I want you to practice doing content analysis on them by coding the statements for the following things. Due process versus crime control. So how much are the different statements emphasizing, people's rights and, make sure you don't convict an innocent person and so on, versus crime control. We want to stop crime, and that's more important than, any of that other stuff. So that's one thing that you'll be coding on. That's one of those conceptual labels that you'll be attaching to these different statements. Another thing to code for is statements about rehabilitation versus retribution. So what's the purpose of punishment here? Is punishment to help offenders grow and learn and change, and be reintegrated into society, all these ideas that go along with rehabilitation? Or do we just want to punish them because they're bad? So you want to code the statements for whether they have more of this rehabilitative orientation or a retributive orientation. And then finally, tell me how much they're focused on the rights of offenders versus the rights of victims. So in these statements, you'd want to code the things that are said by each party and tell me, how, are they more concerned with protecting offenders' rights, or are they more concerned with making sure that victims have rights within the system? And once you've done that, which shouldn't take you more than 10-15 minutes tops, just tell me what themes you think emerged from the data. So in reading through statements by each party, what themes did you see? What patterns do you think might have emerged from these political party platforms? So basically, what does it tell you? And by the way, I actually had no idea this would be timed for election week, but here we go. All right, so once you've done that, I actually want you to copy and paste your coded statements along with codes into a discussion post, then write like a 1 to 2 sentence description of the themes you identified. So you should have the statements themselves, or just number them, a list of codes for each statement, and then a 1 to 2 sentence description of the themes you identified. So again, with any of these activities, I don't want you to spend more than 30 minutes tops on it. This one will probably take you even less time than that. But I do want to see your coded statements along with the theme you identified in the discussion post. Same reminder as always, try your best. And then responses to the activity should be posted to the discussion board by this Thursday, and comments on 2 other students' responses should be posted by Sunday as usual. And I will say, since this one is sort of another one of these sort of research process ones, you can be creative in how you want to respond to other people. I just want to see that you have read what they've done and given some thought to it. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about here is this third project option. And for the third project option, I want you to choose one of the following 2 projects that you could do. And these are the blurbs pulled from the syllabus, and then I'll talk about each one. So for your first project option, you can choose a form of media that addresses criminal justice. So this could be a news article, Facebook group post, police department websites, blogs, Twitter, anywhere that you find people talking about criminal justice. And so literally, be creative, whatever you can think about. And then use content analysis techniques to identify manifest and latent content. And then the second option would be to conduct 3 hours of social observation in a place you've never been before or don't spend a lot of time in. And then get jotted notes while you're there and write them into full field notes that you turn into me. As I said before, option B used to be the only option for this project, but I'm aware that it's more difficult to do safely now, complying with social distancing guidelines. So please only choose this option, if you think you can do it safely. So if you're going somewhere that's outside, if the weather's nice, you could watch what people are doing in a park or something like that. But again, use your discretion here and only do this option if you can do so safely. Whichever one of these two options you choose, you should turn in your project number 3 Sunday, December 6th at 11:59 p.m. And just to reiterate, please only choose one of these two options. There's no advantage whatsoever to turning both of them in. All right, so specifics for project option A, the content analysis option. As I said, you're going to be choosing a form of text media that addresses criminal justice. So this could be any number of things. All I want to see is that there is some sort of text communication and criminal justice is a topic in there somewhere. And you can really be as creative as you want to be on this. Then I want you to conduct content analysis on approximately 1,000 to 1,500 words of whatever your text of choice is. In order to get up to 1,000 to 1,500 words, which is like 2 to 3 pages or so, you would want to probably copy whatever the source is into a Word document and count it. So 1,000 to 1,500 words, that might be like 2 to 3 short news articles, one longer news article, a handful of blog posts, or several comments on something, whatever will get you up to roughly that word count. Then it's up to you to decide what to code for. So you can go back to that slide where I listed what all of these different things mean, but here just see what you're looking at, see what things seem interesting or relevant to you, and code for them. So in this one, I don't necessarily expect you to be testing a theory. Just see what looks like it's interesting and, what common sort of thoughts or ideas appear in your source of choice. And then what I'll ask you to turn in will be your text broken into meaning units that should be assigned codes. So whatever text you have, break it into short chunks, so that's like a sentence or a couple of sentences at most, and then code those meaning units for different things, again, which you have a lot of leeway to choose what you want to do there. And after you've done that, give me a brief discussion of the themes that you identify in that content analysis. So using this sort of systematic way of breaking down text and looking for common ideas within that broken down text, tell me what themes emerge. So basically, whatever your source is, what is it saying about this criminal justice issue that you've chosen? If you're looking at news articles that talk about police use of force from, say the New York Times, how are they approaching this issue? What are they talking about? What are common themes? And what can you really pull from reading these news articles? And what would you conclude about them? And I have an article that you can reference if you want that's sort of a how-to on content analysis that might be helpful. But I'll say you don't have to follow this specifically. All I will be looking for is text broken into meaning units with codes assigned, and then themes identified. You can put your codes into categories if you want, but that's also not required. So as with the other projects, you can find a project assignment sheet for this one on Blackboard as well. If you choose the Project B option, which is to conduct 3 hours of social observation, I will ask you to choose a social setting that you do not know well. So I know it's tempting, but please don't do this in your workplace because you're not going to be learning the techniques of being a researcher, sort of exploring a social setting. So I want you to pick a place that you don't know very well. And this is my list from last year, which I have not changed here, but these were examples. Obviously, many of these are indoors now, so again, please use your discretion and don't necessarily, go to any of these if you can't do so safely. But when I say social setting that you don't know well, just any place where social interactions are occurring that you're not really a regular part of. So you want to practice observing social interactions that are not part of your day-to-day routine. Go there, spend roughly 3 hours there. If it's a little bit less, obviously, I'm not going to know. But spend roughly 3 hours there and take jotted field notes. Again, I strongly recommend just typing them into your phone. Following the social observation, write up full field notes. And your field notes, as I said before, should include more information than your jotted field notes. And in your field notes, you should include a description of the location you go to, detailed and concrete information about what you saw and heard. So again, this is the difference between writing the person was funny and then writing out the joke that was said. So give me as much sort of grounded, concrete information as you can. Also, write out some things that were said or that you heard. So these should be things that, you feel that they really tell you a lot about the social setting itself. And then also include recalled information. So this is information that should appear in your full field notes that is not in your jotted notes. So I want to see more information in your full field notes than in your jotted notes. And finally, you should also include analytic ideas, hunches, impressions, or feelings. So this is what you think about what it is you saw. So I want to really get your full experience in this new place. And this was the assigned reading that I'm going to say is not assigned except for this purpose here. And so I will, you can take a look at this if you end up doing this project, and then if not, I would say you don't need to read it as much. For this project as well, I also have an example. This was something that I did in grad school in a similar class where I was told to go spend 3 hours in a social setting, observe it, and take field notes. So as a grad student, I decided to go to a porn shop in a small and declining Rust Belt town in upstate New York, where I also happen to live, called Schenectady. And this was quite the place. I spent 3 hours there. I called ahead, asked if I could do this, and the guy behind the counter said, yes, but don't tell my manager. So I went and I spent 3 hours there and pretended to look around if anybody came in. Don't necessarily do what I did, but that's where this came from. And so what I have here are jotted field notes from this experience and also full field notes. So you can take a look at these if you want to get an idea for what the expectations are for this project. And I will say that this is not exactly a perfect project. There are some things in the jotted field notes that I didn't put into the full field notes because I knew less then than I do now. But you can get a sense for what the jotted field notes should look like. These were all typed out on my phone, and what full field notes should look like, and the sort of information that you would want to include. All right, so that concludes today's lecture. And I hope you guys all have a great week.